Hi there, my name is Marcus. Officially, I'm Dr. Marcus Bussey, and I am making this recording in Australia, in the hills above Brisbane, called the Sunshine Coast. And I'm going to be working with you for the week of our Urban Futures Summer School in Lisbon. And I'm making this recording so that I can give you a peep into one of your teachers for that period, but also in preparation for our Tuesday morning workshop, where Dr. Lena Broomheltz and myself are going to be presenting a session on the forms and functions of the urban. So I thought I would say a little bit about myself and then move into presentation of a little PowerPoint lecture or lecturette, if we want to be more precise. So I've been a teacher for many, many years. I've been an academic in the professional sense for 20 years, and I've worked in the area of history, cultural evolution, futures. I've taught sociology and philosophy, along with leading many people on wonderful PhD adventures in the area of futures or futures thinking. That's the area that you'll find that I have written the most on, and it's quite a diverse area. My core interest is in culture and cultural evolution. And that brings me to the city, of course, because the city is like a melting pot. The city is an incubator for ideas and innovation, but it can also be a deeply oppressive, politically, economically oppressive place that has major detrimental impacts on its environment. So there are, as with all things in human life, the good and the bad. So let's move into the lecture itself so that you can get a taste of what's going to happen, particularly on Tuesday morning. But I have to say, I'm looking forward to meeting you all at that time. So here we are. So there's Machu Picchu, which is, in the terms of Kevin Lynch, one of the people that I rely upon often when I think about cities. He wrote a book in 1960 called The Image of the City, which is an absolute classic. And it's well worth looking at even today because it's filled with ideas. And it's based on very solid, very rigorous research. He called cities like Machu Picchu, Beijing's, what do we call it, the Forbidden City and so on, as celestial cities. And they're one of the three major archetypes for cities. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the coming lecture. I'm looking at linking pasts, presents, and futures. They have to be plural because there is no one past, there is no one present, and there's no one future. These things are highly mobile concepts. Whose past are we talking about? Mine, an Australian, or your pasts from whichever country you come from within the European sphere? Perhaps some of you have immigrated from China or India or Sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa for that matter, or from places in the Americas. You come from anywhere, or your ancestors could come from anywhere. Means that you have different experiences, temporal experiences and so on, of place, of purpose, of relationships and so on. All of these factor into how we think about our futures. So, anticipatory aesthetics, good place to start, and starting with something I've been working on for a long time. Essentially, a city, the urban environment, as with the rural environment, they are aesthetic experiences. They affect our senses. Space itself shapes how we perceive and experience who we are. We also have what I'm calling cultural sense or futures senses. These senses shape how we think about and construct our identities and our relationship with past, present, and future. These senses are listed there as memory, foresight, voice, optimism, and yearning. I put a reading up in our shared folder for this particular session on that. It's entitled Anticipatory Aesthetics. To me, these aspects of our cultural identities shape how we think about the urban. For instance, memory. Do you have many experiences of different cities? The more diverse your experiences are, more capable you will be of imagining alternatives. Our memories, databases into the way we develop our sense of foresight. Where do we want to go with cities? Also, hype around what are called smart cities nowadays. But what are these? Are they essentially technologically mediated spaces? And then voice. How do you express yourself? This is about agency. And of course, that's shaped in the intersection between memory and foresight. Do you have a positive vision of the future, or are you deeply worried about the coming climate change issues, the questions that are arising around that? Optimism shapes a certain approach to the future, which is going to be more enabling than pessimism, where we are more likely to want to put up walls like many cities have done over many millennia. What do we yearn for, both as an individual, but also as communities? We yearn for security, but we also yearn for other things, things that expand us. And I think that's a really important aspect of futures thinking. This turns me to a lovely snippet from a beautiful poem by Friedrich Schiller, a German romantic poet. He said, look, we are dead groups of matter when we hate. I wish we could actually put that up somewhere really significant, because hate shrinks us, it contracts us, fear holds us down. But when we love, we are as gods, unto the gentle fetters yearning through each state and shade of being, multiform, and through each all countless spirits, save all of the Sire, God, moves, breathes, and blends the one divine desire. So to me, he's touching something that is essentially human, that it's about yearning often to overcome limitations. And cities brought people together in order to overcome the limitations of scattered agricultural and hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Cities intensified the human experience in that way. They are, at one level at least, to be thought of as machines or mechanisms, cities are, for the expansion of human potential. So let's look at the next point. So there's this concept that I find really exciting, new urbanism. It's being developed by scholars in urban planning around the planet. And this little snippet I'm just offering you here has been taken from a report from 2014 from the US. And the report's called Older, Smaller, Better. The report is available to you also in the readings. It says, after decades of decline and neglect, American cities are once again attracting attention, investment, and new residents. New books document the revival of urban centres and the decline of suburbia. Fast proliferating blogs and websites track the latest developments and hottest neighbourhoods, while magazines profile the most innovative mayors. Geographers and demographers confirm that these are more than passing media trends. Population numbers are up in almost every historic city. Now comes the really important point. Even cities that have suffered some of the steepest population losses are seeing their numbers turn around. Philadelphia and Baltimore, for instance, recently posted their first population gains since the 1950s. So there is a new urbanism, a new sense of what place and cities can provide us as communities and as individuals, a sense that people are returning to and reimagining the possibilities around them. So I'll keep moving, but I want to hold that in the back of our minds, okay? So let's go to another great prophet from the past, one might say. Jane Jacobs wrote a book in 1961 on the life and death of American cities. And it's had a profound effect on the way urban planners have approached cities since the peak of high modernism, which for better and for ill created some of the most ugly city landscapes you could possibly ever imagine. So she makes this point back in 1961. The way to get at what goes on in the seemingly mysterious of cities is, I think, to look closely and with little expectation, get rid of all those expectations as is possible at the most ordinary scenes and events, and attempt to see what they mean and whether any threads of principle emerge from them. In other words, walk the city streets, feel the city around you. Much of her book is about walking streets, looking at areas that are either in configuring themselves, reimagining themselves. This city here, this is one of my favorite woodcuts. It's the city of Florence in the 14th century. And some of you probably have been to Florence, but you know, you walk the streets of the heart of this place, the historic heart of a city, and feel what it might have been like, one, to be a person in the Renaissance walking the streets, one, what it might have been like to be an 18th or 19th century traveller visiting the city, or a resident, perhaps a baker, or a young mother, or an elderly person going to the cathedral to celebrate Mass, and then jump into our present time, where of course it's a tourist mecca now, but there is still a sense that Florence holds on to its deeper story. She's saying, look at the most ordinary scenes. This is one of the reasons why in this summer school we're planning to look at the sensory experiences of cities, to go out and explore aspects of the city. The city of Lisbon, which of course is itself a wonderfully historic city. Let's move on. So then there was this quite an amazing character, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was actually a judge in the US. Who lived a remarkably long life, but he had many things to say about human condition. One of them is that civilizations, they happen in cities. Think of the word civilization, it's built around the word civis, which is the Latin for city. The chief worth of a civilization is just that it makes the means of living more complex, brings things together. That's that mysterious looking that Jane Jacobs was talking about, that it calls for great and combined intellectual efforts instead of simple, uncoordinated ones, in order that the crowd, that's you and me walking around the city, may be fed and clothed and housed and moved from place to place. Because more complex and intense intellectual effort means a fuller and richer life. Cities can lead to fuller and richer lives. They mean more life, just more life. Life is an end in itself. I think it's a beautiful quote. And here we have an image from Mughal India, in which people are trading in cities, the great cities of the Silk Road, for instance, Samarkand and so on, but the old red city of Delhi, or I think of the Red Gate in Delhi, and places like that. These wonderful, rich cities that grew around international trade and commerce, but also around the movements of people. So what can we say then? Presence in the city, that's being in the space of a city, like old New York here or whatever it is. Space affects us and it shapes us. It shapes our consciousness. So let's turn to Jane Jacobs again, who back in 1961 wrote the following two things. First of all, please look closely at a real city. Think of your own city. Look at your own city. Or if you're a person, think of the last time you were in a city. What did it feel like? While you were looking, you might as well also listen and linger and think about what you see. I think that's wonderful. We can't jump to conclusions too quickly. Good thinking is often really slow thinking. We might have flashes of inspiration, but those flashes emerge out of a continuous engagement with the world around us. Cities are an immense laboratory of trial and error, failure and success in city building and city design. Laboratory. Cities are laboratories for culture. They're economic laboratories. They are social laboratories, political laboratories, and so on. We can just come up with a list. In fact, I've got a good list coming up, so I won't jump further into that right now. So, form and function. There's a great historian, Peter Watson, who makes this point about cities. He reckons that there are three aspects or three parts to a city. I put up a chapter from his book Ideas for you in our readings for this particular session. I hope you enjoyed. He spent a lot of time looking at how writing evolved in cities, but I'm not going to go there right now. I'm going to look at the way he structures this. He's looking at the archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, and he points out excavations have shown that these early urban areas in Mesopotamia were usually divided into three. There was an inner city with its own walls, inside which we found the temples of the gods, plus the palace of the ruler, administrator, religious leader, and or a number of private houses. Okay, so you've got that central core. You can see it here in this artificial city. That central core. Okay, now we can have temples and we can have political centers like parliament houses or whatever it is, government houses, but our gods are very much shifted from being the gods of celestial beings to much more economic gods, you might say, and that's really an interesting thing in itself. But nonetheless, we have core to our cities. In Australia, we call it the central business areas or the district, the CBD. Okay, around that sits the suburbs. They consist of much smaller houses, communal gardens, cattle pens, and they provide day-to-day produce and support for us, the citizens. And finally, there is a commercial centre. I'm thinking of the Agora in Athens, for instance, where not only commerce was conducted, but also all forms of negotiations and relationships and the politics of the day, as well as philosophy. That was where the great philosopher Socrates used to wander around, and he would have chats with people. And on the edge of the Agora, he had his own little shop himself. So there are these three sections of cities. I'm sure you can still find these places if you go looking in cities that you know. So I mentioned Kevin Lynch's image of the city. There's a link to it there. There's the celestial city, the organic, and the digital. What does he mean? Well, these are archetypes. Archetypes are shared images of anything that you choose to think about. The archetype for a woman might be Venus, but also it could be some form of, the dark woman, the witch, the temptress. The archetype for nature might be a lofty mountain surrounded by clouds, but it also could be the jungle, the snake or the tiger, and so on. These are symbolic representations. When Kevin Lynch was doing his analysis on the image of the city, he decided on three, or he suggests three. The celestial city is the city, the forbidden city of the great emperors of China, for instance. It was also to be found in the ancient Egyptian cities, the ancient Mesopotamian cities, cities of sub-Saharan Africa, cities of Central and South America, all across Asia. The celestial city had at its core a very beautifully proportioned, elevated above everything else, usually a temple for the gods. Okay, and that temple often also functioned as a center for political leadership and so on. So the celestial city is a city that links the human with the superhuman, the divine, and so on. The organic city is a city much more like the medieval cities that sort of started out as a village and just grew haphazardly as it evolved into a city from some smaller unit like a township or a village, or even just a small cluster of farms coming together. So the organic city is the city where the streets wind and meander and twist and turn and so on. I'm sure you can probably all think of cities like that. Then there's the digital city. The digital city is the planned city. Here we can think of, the orthogonal planning that came out of Miletus with the ancient Greeks, summarizing that form of city as the most efficient, logical, and rational city. It's a rational city. The digital city, a good example would be the original plans and layout for Alexandria, which was set up by Alexander the Great and built by the first Ptolemy kings, the Ptolemaic emperors, or pharaohs, you'd call them, not emperors, pharaohs of Egypt, that represent or reflect the Hellenization of Egyptian culture, though the Greeks were as Egyptianified as the locals were Hellenified, one might say. Culture always goes both ways. So I want to make a few other points here. So for Lynch, he didn't just see the city in archetypal form, he also saw it in terms of its parts. Features of a city, the paths, the edges, the districts, the nodes, and the landmarks that you would say characterize cities, particularly our human experience of cities. As we walk around a city, we find pathways through parks to make shortcuts to places. There are the edges of the cities and there are the districts. There are districts that we know are wealthier, safer, or not so safer. There are also districts that we know we can go and buy all our merchandisey type stuff from there. But if you want really good food, the markets are over there. There are nodes of activity. These might be semi-commercial, commercial, residential, mixed residential, and so on. And there are, of course, landmarks, those things that sort of stand out above everything else. Like whenever I was working a month ago in Uppsala in Sweden, and they have this wonderful two-spired cathedral there, and I could always orient myself to where I was going by locating where is that a landmark, for instance. And so you can think of landmarks that define most urban areas. They're usually the biggest or the tallest thing, but it can be, I was in Rio de Janeiro a few years ago, it can be just those wonderful hills that are sort of rock pillars almost that come and leap out of the urban and sort of the intrusions of nature are beautiful there. So landmarks are important. Now, let's quick history here. Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Possibly you all know about it. I'm not sure. I never know who knows about these things and who doesn't. Çatalhöyük is the first, you could say, semi-urban area. They think that it housed somewhere around 12,000 people at its peak. It's 9,000 years ago that this place emerged. Interesting thing, it had no streets. Okay, you got everywhere by walking around on the rooftops, and went down ladders into the various homes and other, I guess, environments like that. They marked by a very powerful female cult. So we have a female figure there that's been unearthed in the archaeological dig. It's an amazing sight. Go and look up Çatalhöyük, and you'll be looking into some of the earliest ways human beings tried to organize themselves when their numbers went beyond 50 to 100. And so there's a lot we can learn and are still learning. There is probably another 100 years of excavation at least to go on in a place like Çatalhöyük. Many of these sites are so large that what archaeologists are doing is partitioning off and saying, no, we're not going to go and look at that part at all, as much as I'd like to. One, because we've got to do a proper job on this spot, but we don't know what new techniques and technologies may emerge to help us learn even more about what was going on in these sites. So Çatalhöyük is where we could say, let's say our urban history story starts. Then we can jump to early cities, like the city of Ur, that's this one here, an extraordinary site, one of the very first large cities in Mesopotamia. Then, of course, we have Rome, and of course, we have New York. So these offer us, if we're thinking in terms of archetypes or images, classic exemplars, which word I want, for thinking about the urban. And, you know, in researching this one, I came across this amazing article that New York there is sinking, not simply as a result of climate change, but due to the weight of the skyscrapers, and it's sinking by about 2 millimeters a year, and in some places as much as 1.8, so 18 millimeters per year. Is that, I think it's, yes, that's active. So that's the article for that, just in case you want to find out about it. But look, cities have an ecological relationship. Okay, it's kind of like they don't just grow out of nowhere. They're not just economic centers. Their nature is all around them and riddled through them. I chose this image because it's just a wonderful one. These are Hakka buildings. Hakka are a Chinese ethnic group, and this is in the south of China. And as you can see, it's green and lush. But look at these amazing buildings. And you know, these buildings have existed for, you know, millennia, you could say. But what's interesting for me is the way that this culture wove itself into the natural fabric, the eco-social context here on the slide. It's well worth thinking about this because increased innovation is occurring in cities today around greening of city centres, whether it's definitely part of this concept of the new urbanism, but it's also part of the concept of sustainable cities. And as cities are starting to really take seriously the imminence of climate change, we make cities more livable in the future, when particularly temperatures are going to get even hotter over the next century. So this is something we need to think about. So the new urbanism, looking to the past, can help us in many ways and inspire us with cultural insights and cultural techniques that have been practiced by pre-modern or non-Western cultures, depending on how you want to label them, for many millennia. So here we are looking out over, Samarkand. I had to think which city I'd chosen, simply because it's so beautiful. Samarkand on the Silk Roads, and a great city as part of the Islamic civilizations of Central Asia. So what makes for a city? If you had a recipe book and you had to go, what are the things? Well, this is my set of recipes. I didn't actually go to any sources. I've been teaching this for so long. I just went tick, and came up with a list. No list is ever complete, by the way. So, and you can question me or query me, challenge me on any of these things when we meet in person. So what makes a city? Well, religious and political center. Seems to me pretty straightforward, that one. It always has built infrastructures. Even those earliest cities, like Çatalhöyük, they all have evidence of central planning to get rid of waste, to bring water in or out, and ship waste out, and so on. So these are really important dimensions there. Urban planning is quite more central planning is what I was referring to with built infrastructure. Population concentrations. We have large numbers of people for the first time in human history living in cheek by jowl, as we say in English, in close proximity. And that means some things have to happen. You have to have laws. You have to regulate human behavior, because humans aren't necessarily rational or nice. We can be, but we can also be, especially when put under pressure, both irrational and very unpleasant. So how do we manage this? What do we do? one of the things we do is we specialize. You can be the potter, you can be the baker, I'm going to be the judge, you can be the scribe, and so on. We have specialization occurring in cities. Very, very important, because that allowed people to also specialize at being rich and lazy and just doing great things like painting and writing poetry and coming up with wonderful myths and stories. I'm being a little facetious there, but it did allow for specialization that was not just flat specialization, sharing of trades and so on, but it also allowed the concentration of wealth, which then led to elites having leisure time to create, I guess, more elaborate, richer culture, which obviously gets spread out to the broader communities. So, control of population and natural resources, that means you need order in cities. You need a hierarchy, or you don't need a hierarchy, but a hierarchy emerges when you have economic concentration. I'm just thinking, do we need a hierarchy? This is something we can discuss, I think. But right now, hierarchies are not necessary at all, but they form parts of what occurs when we have massive wealth concentrations, what we would call surpluses. Agricultural systems developed surpluses. Surpluses led to the concentration of wealth in the hands of people who emerged over many generations, usually as leaders, family leaders, elites, aristocrats, crooks, you could call them as well. But this is what happens in cities. We also have lots of intellectual innovation, both in technology, but also, as I was suggesting earlier, in the arts, in aesthetics. And one last point that came to me as I was typing that list, I suddenly thought, yes, it's also about diversity or heteronomy. The diversity is really important. That Jane Jacobs, in her early book, the 1961 book, The Life and Death of American Cities, that she points to as a way of revitalizing areas is to actually value diversity in cities. And her book is very much about chronicling that, but the new urbanism and so on that is being developed and thought through by city planners around the world is also acknowledging the role it plays in cities and the vibrancy of city life or urban life. Now, cities are also hungry places. Cities are hungry for energy, drawing in huge amounts of energy from the environment, from the country, both in terms of food, like bread. I put that up because I was literally thinking of bread and circuses with ancient Rome. But cities are hungry for people from all over. Rome was one of the most ethnically diverse places on the planet in its heyday during the imperial period. Cities are hungry for ideas, innovation. They're hungry to control. They have to control the masses. That's Rome's bread and circuses again. They're hungry for security. Many cities have walls, and they have walls because they needed to keep people out who they didn't want in the city, for instance. Here I'm thinking of Constantinople with its incredible walls, but the places, that's Islamabad. No, Istanbul. I mean, not Islamabad, Istanbul. They're hungry for spectacle. That's the incredible landmarks that they build, landmarks that represent power, authority, but also that even the poorest citizen in a city can be proud of. They're hungry for resources, which in a sense is me repeating myself. It's hungry for energy, hungry for resources. And I chose to put hungry for food because that's something that we're going to be exploring with some keen thoughts, I guess, coming from Lena particularly, but with me also, because the history of food is the history of human culture in many respects as well. But it's hungry for food, which could be said to be resources, which could be said to be energy at the very top there as well. Depends on how you want to frame these things. But cities are hungry places. So turning to a principle that I started off talking about is that we have pasts, presents, and futures. Continuity, place identification, and so on are really important. Juhani Pallasmaa is a Finnish architect who is absolutely stunning. I have his book right here, The Thinking Hand. Always gets me thinking. He has a very aesthetic approach and also a very embodied phenomenological approach to thinking about space. So one of the thoughts about space, he says, is that, we have to think temporally. We have to think in time. So he says, we have a mental need to experience that we are rooted in the continuity of time. We do not only inhabit space, but we also dwell, that's a beautiful word, in time. Buildings and cities are museums of time. They emancipate us from the hurried time of the present and help us to experience the slow healing time of the past. Architecture enables us to see and understand the slow processes of history and to participate in time cycles that surpass the scope of an individual life. That's a really powerful way to think about our experience of the urban. As we think about the city of Lisbon that this workshop is being conducted in, Lisbon is layer upon layer upon layer of time. Human lives lived in all those spaces and will continue way beyond our lifetimes to live in urban spaces. Those spaces at times can be incredibly vital and dynamic. At other times, they can dwindle, like, somebody who's really sick. Rome went from, a city of over 1 million people in the height of its imperial age to around the year 800, I've got to get my dates right, to a city of around 15 to 20,000 people. And then it re-emerged again. So, cities go through cycles. Cities like Detroit and Chicago shrinking and then growing again, finding new ways to express human longing, human yearning, human potential. So what are we dealing with when we think about cities? We're thinking in terms of order, disorder, excess. Bayo Akamalafe is a guy that I really enjoy reading, and he makes me think all the time, or when I hear him on YouTube or whatever. I just want to pick up on this one aspect that he's talking about here. And he's not talking in particular relating to cities, but he's talking about culture and the way the world is wedded together, knitted together. He says that, what we can think of is speculative possibilities of excess, not diminution, excess, surplus. Something extra is at work, even in the most desolate of places and circumstances. This is really important, and it's part of what I mean when I'm talking about future senses and optimism. That wherever we are, and Bayer is writing in the city of Chennai, with a massive churning city in the south of India, a Tamil city. It's quite an amazing place, but it's also a place of immense poverty and incredible divides between the rich and the poor and so on. So what can we say about cities? Well, there are different ways of thinking about the future. There's a possible future. Now I'm turning to the futures cone on my left here. There's the future we would like, a preferred future. There's a probable future if we sit around on our hands and do nothing, okay? And there's a plausible future. That could happen. So, we've got the possible future is pretty much anything out there. And it can be anything that, like the imagined cities of some distant planetary universe created by Marvel Studios or any of those sorts of things, the science fiction stories. It can be fantasy futures. And now I'm starting to think in terms of the fantastic imaginings of what are they called, solar punk futures, for instance. But they can be much more predictable futures. They can be futures of cities where cities continue to look and function in the same way that they do today, but with deteriorating conditions for us who live in the city, simply because a story or a game, and climate change is catching up with them. Cities that might be partially submerged, New York, for instance, or here in Australia, particularly Sydney, but also my home city of Brisbane, built on a river, already experiences really major flooding, and many homes that actually the state government here is buying homes back of people whose homes have been they were allowed to be built in areas that are flood prone and have been devastated in the last few years by flooding experiences. Cities, many of them are built on wet and watery spots. Think of Lisbon, but think of many other cities, and they are all at risk from the rising sea levels, for instance. So let's keep moving then. So there we have order and disorder in cities. We have them combined. Cities are not stable sites, okay? Now, let's look at a few statistics. I like this. This is from the project that I was mentioning, where I'm just trying to think of the, I can't think of the name of the project. I cited it earlier on. My brain's too far away. But, here we have a few things. This is basically celebrating diversity. These are little infographics. San Francisco here and Seattle here. What they have found is that areas in San Francisco, older, smaller, more age-diverse populations have significantly higher percentages of jobs in smaller business than in areas of mostly newer, larger buildings. There's the job ratio there for large buildings, centralized buildings, 34%, 44% in smaller, older, more diverse communities. This one's a particularly interesting one for me, is the place for women and minority ownership, okay? Where you have those smaller, more diverse age groups, older, and that's the title of the project I was trying to think of. We have twice the rate found in areas mostly newer and larger buildings. In other words, women and minority ownership is way higher. Now, interesting for me is because I've just been going over her book again, the Life and Death of Great American Cities from 1961. This is exactly what Jane Jacobs was saying in 1960 or 61 when she was writing that book, that her research was showing the same thing. So it's very, very interesting to see that the pattern has continued. But even in 1961, Jacobs was lamenting the fact that she could talk to her urban planner friends working in, let's say, Boston, and that was one of her chief examples, where they say, yes, it's a nice place to walk around, but it's depressed. It's black hole of our city. If we could only get rid of it and make it orderly like the rest of the place. But these are places where people were moving back to in 1960, 61 that Jacobs was researching. And she was finding the same thing, that diversity of age-diverse buildings and so on were the areas which were being revitalized. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Heading towards the end of this little lecture, The Good Ancestor, I've got the book here, The Good Ancestor by Roman Krishnarik. Very inspiring read, and I put up parts of it for you on the reading list site as well. But what I wanted to look at here was, when we think about the urban and we think about our own interests, perhaps you're going to be working in areas of urban planning and so on, or as a consultant engineer, or as a whatever. We need to understand that cities, as Palasma points out, cities are temporal units that span generations, and many generations, centuries, millennia. And that means that what we choose to do today will make us a good ancestor if we make the right kinds of decisions. So good ancestry is about, one of the things that Krishna calls it is thinking, or cathedral building. People who start to build a cathedral in the Middle Ages, they never saw the building complete. It took, up to 200 years for a cathedral to be completed. So these are people who were building across time with no expectation of seeing the fruits of their labors. It's kind of like planting an oak seed, an acorn, knowing that you might see it sprout and maybe get into its teens or maybe even longer. You're definitely not going to see it in its maturity, in its full glory. So that makes me think about what I call cultural evolution. And Krishna is also writing about it in his book, but this is me giving you some thoughts on cultural as opposed to natural selection. That's the title of the reading, and it's also up for you, available for you on the reading list area. So from a world historical perspective, one of those fun subjects to teach, culture can be seen as an adaptive response to the human desire to expand beyond limitations. Now that's worth thinking about, isn't it? So this desire is essentially spiritual and hinges on our deep need to belong in a universe that dwarfs us, makes us feel so small, and seems to care little for our efforts. Cultural evolution, therefore, is an adaptive response. Human beings long ago, a million years ago or so, started realizing that when we cooperate, we have a better chance of survival. Mammals, and particularly primates, have been cooperative animals anyway, but we started developing specific tools, a larger brain. At some point, we developed language, and we started to organize ourselves in ways that gave us advantage. And that advantage was passed down because of memory, and it became the ability to organize good, the most optimal food sources were going to be, how to prepare and follow the hunt, for instance. And then, of course, it became agriculture, and we started noticing that, oh, we threw seeds here last year, and now this year plants are here, oh, and they're giving us the same food. And eventually that sort of becomes agriculture, especially when certain environmental pressures arise. That's something that in his chapter on the cities that I've shared with you, that that environmental pressures often stimulate cultural evolution, cultural change. And that's exactly what we are experiencing today, is that environmental pressures, socioeconomic pressures as well, but they're environmental as well, but they're environmental human-made pressures are forcing us to rethink the urban. What does it in nature? So last thoughts, just check, yes, it is the last thoughts, I thought it was. From another really nice read from Kalina Tonhaba, she makes 2 points, or she's quoting people actually. Urban nature is an effective climate mitigation tool, okay, that can help local governments save energy, reduce emissions, and save money. So economic case there. So urban nature, that's meaning that culture is not here in nature over there. They are intimately woven together. Historically, we've thought of environmentalism as at odds with development and urban places. Aha, Coyne says, no. Now there's a new focus. How do we think about embedding more ecosystem functions into our urban core, our suburban neighborhoods, throughout communities? This is the greening of the city, sustainable cities, and so on. But it's also to do with really, how do we feed ourselves in cities? Where do we go in this universe of incredible plenty, but also environmental stress and the potential decline of plenty through traditional routes? In other words, we're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to evolve our cultures in ways that 2 generations ago would have been unthinkable. I think that's really exciting, and I hope you engage with us in a conversation on this in the session that we're going to run in on July the 8th. Okay, stop share. Look at my messy hair. Cool. I will say goodbye to you, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.